Well, Angelia, thank you very much indeed for the warmth and generosity of that introduction, to which I don't know that I'm entirely equal, but I shall strive to do my level best not to disappoint you or to cause you, worse still, to fall to sleep. And indeed, I'm moved to observe, on the strength of those opening remarks from you, that having heard myself introduced, I can hardly wait to hear myself speak. Whether you'll feel the same way at the end of my presentation, my friends, is a matter for legitimate speculation and conjecture. We shall have to await the chronology of events. But I'm almost invariably inclined to inquire at the outset of a presentation in a balmy, B-A-L-M-Y, lecture theatre, can you hear me at the back? To which there is a moderately encouraging cry of yes, and even one or two thumbs raised, which I take as a mark of exhortation or even provisional approval. And I'm further moved to observe on the back of that helpful and informative reply that it does represent a marked improvement upon the other occasion on which I posed that selfsame question to an audience in a lecture theatre of a university, can you hear me at the back, in which some unhelpful wag replied, yes, but I shall happily change places with someone who can't. So I think that, I won't say I should quit while I'm ahead, but I'm starting on a positive note in front of what I hope will be a friendly, but above all, a quizzical and interested audience. I do find many a time and oft, in fact, almost invariably these days, in the light of media coverage and misguided commentary, that I need to begin my presentation with a treatment of one quite delicate and sensitive matter, which I wager your natural courtesy will probably disincline you to raise with me directly, but which, if unaddressed, will lurk mischievously and perhaps from my vantage point perilously in the undergrowth, and which I conclude therefore must be knocked on the head at the outset before I further proceed, and that is the delicate and sensitive matter of height. Very specifically, it has been bruited in some of the more down-market parts of the British press that I'm the shortest man ever to be Speaker of the UK House of Commons. I want to say to you, my friends, with all the force and rhetorical insistence at my command, that there is nothing wrong with being short. On the law of averages, the likelihood is that a proportion of you, though I know not to whom this applies because you are seated, will probably share that characteristic of vertical challenge with me. We short people should stick together. We may be short, but we may also be and judge ourselves to be perfectly formed. In any case, we're environmentally friendly. We don't take up a lot of space. And more particularly, I suppose, I am making a virtue of necessity. That is to say, I have always been short. I'm now 56 years old and I remain short, and given the known impact of the aging process upon physiognomy, the overwhelming likelihood is that I shall become inexorably and irrevocably shorter still. And about the fact of that continued and soon to be exacerbated shortness, I am as intensely relaxed as Peter Mandelson once said, famously, or in some people's minds infamously, that he was intensely relaxed and New Labour was intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich. But I'm not intensely relaxed about the matter of historical accuracy. You would expect the Speaker, forsooth, to have done his research, and I hope in that respect, if in no other, I will not disappoint you. I have done, and simply as a matter of fact, it's quite wrong when some of these more down-market, fifth-rate, low-music hall scribblers say, oh, well, Bercow's the shortest man ever to be Speaker of the UK House of Commons. Sir John Bussey, Speaker of the UK House of Commons, from 1394 to 1398. Sir John Wenlock, Speaker from 1455 to 1456, and Sir Thomas Tresham, Speaker in 1459, are all believed to have been shorter than I am, although I do have to admit that this was true only after all three of them had been beheaded. Indeed, no fewer than 7 of my predecessors met their end on the executioner's block. 1 was killed in battle, and a further poor unfortunate soul was brutally murdered. So you will understand that this does enable me to view the woes and challenges which afflict and confront the House of Commons, and which I candidly concede periodically afflict and confront me with an appropriate sense of historical perspective. That is to say, whatever else happens to me, I'm not likely to lose my head. I am, moreover, keen to treat of one other concern that relates not specifically to me, but to the wider political class that I represent. You will know that it is an habitual refrain of large proportions of the public that politicians are wont to sit on the fence, to procrastinate, to dodge the question. Well, that may be so, but I have hot-footed it to Nottingham Trent University, not least to inform you, as stop press news, that whatever you may think of that view of the procrastinating, fence-sitting, question-ducking politician, the master of the genre hails not from the politics of the United Kingdom, but indeed from the politics of the United States, specifically in the form of the otherwise forgotten but now to be remembered Congressman Fred Schwingle, representative of Iowa, who was wont to receive a very large volley of letters from his constituents on the vexed question of whiskey, brackets, merits or demerits thereof, close brackets, to which, in writing, Congressman Schwingle responded thus: I have always been prepared to take a stand on any issue, no matter how controversial. You have asked me, and they were equally divided, what I think about whiskey, and I will tell you. If when you say whiskey, you mean the devil's brew, the poison scourge, the bloody monster that defiles innocence, dethrones reason, destroys the family, creates misery and poverty, literally takes the bread out of the mouths of our little children, if you mean the evil drink that topples Christian men and women from the pinnacles of righteous, gracious living into the bottomless pit of degradation and despair, shame, helplessness, and hopelessness, then certainly I am against it with all of my power. But if when you say whiskey, you mean the philosophic wine, the oil of conversation, the drink that causes a smile on men's lips, contentment in their eyes, and the warm glow of satisfaction of all those around them, if you mean the drink the same that pours untold billions of dollars into our treasuries to provide tender care for our little crippled children and to build highways, hospitals, and schools, then I am all in favor of it. This is my view, and I will not compromise. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there are 2 reasons I'm thrilled to be here. The first relates to the Political Studies Association, and the second relates to the university. So far as the PSA is concerned, perhaps I can take this opportunity publicly to record my respect for and appreciation of the work of the association. As you approach the 70th anniversary of your work, it's time to take stock. I hope to stage a series of ceremonial events next year and to build on what you've achieved. As an institution which over 7 decades has inducted people into the study of the academic discipline of political science, thereafter honing, nurturing, and cultivating that interest amongst generations, particularly of young people, but not only of young people, I think the PSA can be incredibly proud. Whether it be this conference, your annual awards ceremony, for me, the highlight of which is the award to school students. I have the great privilege as chair of the judging panel each year to judge the winning school for the production of a video on a selected political theme, or whether it be your academic journals, the blogs, the special events, the provision of learning resources, and the very conscious and unremitting effort made to engage with policymakers, opinion formers, and educational institutions, particularly schools. I think it is fantastic work. It is, I know, a rather prosaic truism, but I hope a prosaic truism worth reiteration, that we tend to say two words which cost nothing far too rarely, and we ought to say those words more often. And those words are thank you. Thank you to the Political Studies Association and all who subscribe to it for what is, frankly, a stellar effort. I've always felt this undying gratitude to my own university, the University of Essex. I had the chance to go to university. I was the first person in my family to have the chance to go. I use that expression, to have the chance to go, my friends, advisedly, because my father was clever enough, but it simply wasn't a credible proposition for him in the 1930s, growing up in Dalston in the East End of London, to consider going to university when he was one of 4 siblings and with 2 loving parents who didn't have 2 halfpennies to rub together. And some years later, my mother grew up, untypically by the standards of the time, as the child of a single mum, a loving and devoted mum, but again, with absolutely no resources in the household. And my mother had, and retains to this day, an enormous, almost voracious love of reading and of literature, of fiction in particular. And her interest has always been in the field of literature, cinema, theatre, ballet, and so on. But the idea that mum could go to university in the 1940s was simply not possible. She eventually went, I'm pleased to say, and graduated with a degree in English literature from the University of Middlesex in 1998. And I remember going to her university degree ceremony with great pride. It's just a pity that her entrance to university was delayed by approximately half a century. So the fact that I had the chance to go to university and to cultivate this enormous and consuming interest in politics, the study of the subject, the reflection on ideas, the commitment to research, the readiness to review one's position, is something for which I've been grateful, frankly, for 34 years since I left Essex University. So all credit to the PSA, and indeed to Nottingham Trent University, which of course has just won, and we couldn't not know it because it's the strapline right across the university campus, and I don't blame them, the award from The Guardian of University of the Year 2019, which I think comes on top of getting the Times Higher Education Supplement Award for University of the Year in 2017. So it has made a manifold leap in the rankings and in the esteem both of students, of academics, and of journalistic commentators as well. So it's great that Nottingham Trent is hosting this event, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. Let me talk you through the thrust of what I want to convey to you today. Championing Parliament is perhaps unsurprisingly my key theme, and I raise that theme with the intention of focusing on it against what might seem to be an unpropitious backdrop. On the one hand, you have serious and serial woes afflicting the major political parties. On the other hand, you have a straightforward and stark division of public opinion on Brexit. And you have a genuine, widely felt, and also media-fueled rancor to, dissatisfaction with, feeling of contempt for Parliament, for the political class, for the so-called them up highs. So in those circumstances, you might think, well, why is John so excited about Parliament and talking about it? Well, I suppose the really simple answer is that I've got to make the best of it as I'm the Speaker of the House of Commons, and you would expect me to celebrate my institution and those who work in it. But I suppose the particular point that I want to make is, yes, there is widespread dissatisfaction. There is grave uncertainty. Lots of people have misgivings, and there are real and, in some cases, unbridgeable and unreconcilable problems. However, amidst all of that, there is one stark stat, and I don't want to belabor you with a vast panoply of statistics, that I think is significant. In October of last year, 230,000 people viewed Parliament, the proceedings of Commons and Lords. In March of this year, the figure was 1.75 million. That is more than a seven-fold increase in the space of 5 months, and it notably coincides with the release, the publication of the withdrawal agreement from the European Union, and then the flow of debates, interrogation, dispute, and argument since. Now, of course, those figures will doubtless decrease. I'm not suggesting that we will retain that level, but I suppose the point I'm making is people might not be contented, they might not be happy, they might not approve, they might even in significant measure and numbers disapprove, but they are at least not disengaged from and uninterested in, but rather interested in and focused on what we are discussing. So it seems to me that that is a reasonable starting point. A lot of people are taking notice of what is going on in Parliament. Now, as you will know, it's consistent with, indeed demanded by the history and tradition and rubric of the office of Speaker, that the Speaker is and must remain impartial. And I've always insisted, and I will always do so, that I am impartial between the political parties. It's not for the Speaker to support the government or to support the opposition, to support one party or to support another. I am impartial between the political parties. Moreover, in debate after debate after debate after debate after debate on whatever subject, sitting in that chair, as befits my office, I am impartial between different political opinions. My role is to facilitate the fullest and fairest expression of opinion that exists in the House of Commons as my judgment and time will allow. But I emphasize I'm impartial between the parties and impartial between different political opinions. So I'm impartial in the chamber. But I am absolutely not, never have been and never will be impartial about the chamber, about the legislature, about Parliament, about the role of the House of Commons as the required scrutineer of the executive branch of our political system. I am passionately pro-Parliament. For what it is worth, I do not believe that Parliament should be browbeaten, harangued, or intimidated into taking a particular stance. Rather, I believe the House of Commons should be enabled, encouraged, and exhorted to do institutionally, and its members to do individually, what they judge to be right. For that is the defining difference between a parliamentary democracy on the one hand and what you might call a plebiscitary or Greek city-state democracy on the other. I believe in the role of parliamentary democracy. Now, that doesn't mean being stuck in a time warp. It doesn't mean a kind of smug satisfaction with all that exists. Not just pride in, but a tendency to imitate or dwell on the planet of the past. On the contrary, when I took up post as Speaker back in June 2009, I think I encapsulated the thrust of my mission by saying I want to keep the best and improve the rest. And very specifically, I did feel that there was a lethargy and a slowness and an unresponsiveness and a disconnection between Parliament and people at that time, that very often we weren't debating what people wanted us to be debating, but we could have been debating what people wanted us to be debating. And very specifically, I said, well, look, if you elect me, I'll speed up progress. We ought to have more questions. And as a matter of fact, we get through about 25% more questions now than we did a decade ago. And more particularly, the questions that are posed ought to be capable of being urgent questions. It seemed to me very much an unsatisfactory relic of a bygone age that we could debate only what was on the order paper, very much at the behest of and driven by the government of the day. And if somebody wanted to raise a matter that was inconvenient to or potentially embarrassing for or would lead to very searching scrutiny of the government of the day, and it wasn't convenient for the government of the day, then it wouldn't be allowed to be debated. So I remember saying to colleagues back in 2009, I think that we ought to start with a renaissance of the urgent question, capital U, capital Q, for which there is provision in our standing orders, but which over decades seems to have fallen into desuetude. And I seem to recall that in the year before I was elected Speaker, 2 urgent questions were granted by the Speaker, because that is the procedure. A member applies to the Speaker. I think in my first year we had 24, but over the last 9.5 years we've had 595, which isn't me, as Speaker, saying the government's wrong on this, or alternatively, the government's right on this, because that's not for the Speaker to say. But it is the Speaker saying, this is a matter that warrants the attention of the House of Commons today. The member has legitimately applied for an exchange on this subject, which is urgent and which must cause a representative of the government to come to the chamber, whatever else he or she may be doing, to respond to it, leading typically to 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45 minutes of debate. And I personally believe that that has been a good thing, both for members of Parliament and for government. Good for members of Parliament because instead of retreating into the radio station or the television studio, or just sitting ensconced in his or her office, despairing of the chance to raise this topical and urgent matter, a member knows that he or she can apply to the Speaker and will have a decent chance of being able to air that subject and to interrogate the Minister, spawning further interrogation by colleagues. So in terms of acting as a magnet for attendance and participation in the chamber, it has, I think, been an absolute 100% positive. It has increased backbench participation and opposition frontbench participation. In terms of government, what it really ensures is that ministerial feet are held to the fire. Ministers are right to be in office because they've been put there legitimately. They're right to have the salary, they're right to have the ministerial car, they're right to have the red box, they're right to have the power. But they're ultimately, first and foremost, accountable to the House of Commons, accountable to the legislature, accountable to the elected representatives of the people. And in my experience, ladies and gentlemen, the best ministers in successive governments have not objected to the urgent question. Jack Straw, famously both a man of government and quintessentially a parliamentarian, somebody who was almost in love with the House of Commons and had a reputation for attending very closely to the arguments that were put to him, was always happy to come to the House and to answer an urgent question. Similarly, in the present government, the same can be said of Michael Gove, maybe because he's intellectually dexterous, he's adroit, and he's fleet of foot. He's invariably comfortable to come to the House and to account for himself. But frankly, whether ministers like it or not, that is as it should be. So I absolutely admit that I was not altogether patient with one senior minister who once objected to a UQ granted to one of his own backbenchers by making a telephone call to me to remonstrate, And on a second occasion, he wrote to me to object in the most strenuous terms to my decision to grant that urgent question. On the first occasion, I explained to him that I thought he was wrong and that there would be a lot of interest in the subject, and there was great confusion about government policy, which was on a defence-related matter. And sure enough, there was great interest, and he dealt with it as best he could, and the matter wasn't raised again. Then he moved to another department and wrote me this really long and comprehensive letter explaining why I was wrong to grant an urgent question to one of his backbenchers on the egregious abuse of human rights. And on that occasion, I must admit, and I think Meg Munn, my former parliamentary colleague, will understand this, confidence is vested in the chair to make these decisions, and the chair is not expected at every turn to defend them, because people recognise that someone has to decide. But I wrote back to him and said, I'm extremely grateful to you for taking the time and trouble to offer me your thoughts so comprehensively on this important matter, especially in view of the many and burdensome responsibilities which you have day to day to shoulder. However, I'm sure you will understand that the House has chosen to confer upon me the responsibility for making these judgments, with which, therefore, I feel sure you will rest content, which was my sort of polite way of saying, get lost. And I don't recall receiving a Christmas card from this particular person since, but equally I've not made it a habit of mine to send him one either. But that is as it should be. The urgent question, I think, has established a hold, and I think it's been buttressed in terms of the liveliness, the effectiveness, the unpredictability, and the searching character of parliamentary scrutiny by the enhanced status of the select committees, the Public Accounts Committee, the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, the Treasury Select Committee, the Home Affairs Select Committee being a number of very good examples of committees that have done fantastic work in focusing laser-like on the activities of the executive. And I think that the effectiveness of the UQ has been reinforced also by the work of the Backbench Business Committee, often drawing on petitions, including e-petitions, petitions of different kinds from members of the public, to raise and perhaps raise again big issues otherwise neglected by the House. Now, the Backbench Business Committee has caused a fundamental re-examination of the Hillsborough scandal, leading to criminal prosecutions after that issue lay dormant for decades. But BBCom, through its activities, through the magnificent work of Steve Rotherham and Alison McGovern and a great many others, caused the whole issue to be aired again. Similarly, if I may say so, I think that the work of the Backbench Business Committee in destigmatizing and gradually removing the taboo surrounding mental health has been a very big deal for Parliament and arguably thereby for civil society to boot. And the work of the Backbench Business Committee, too, in addressing the whole issue of contaminated blood and the scandal afflicting the health service and causing widespread death. That has been a big issue which probably wouldn't have arisen if it had just been parked with the executive and left to the government to decide whether it should be aired. So I suppose what I'm really saying in a slightly circumlocutory way is that over the last decade, the House of Commons has started to own its own core functions. And instead of being content with what is deposited on it, it has chosen to fashion its own weapons of parliamentary warfare, if I can put it that way. I would like to think that there is more to be done. And in particular, I think what we need moving forward, given the premium upon time and the pace of technological advance and the impatience and zest with which people live their daily lives, their desire for instant resolution or at least response, is we need greater flexibility and fluidity in the parliamentary timetable. Maybe in the future, the urgent question and the emergency debate, instead of being the exception, will become the norm. And I hope I can be forgiven without courting undue controversy. And as you will know, I'm always very reluctant to court undue controversy. I can be excused for observing that given that everybody else has to work in a hurry, might we not in Parliament before too long, though I accept it's for the House and not for me, ask again the question, do we really need to spend hours and hours and hours and hours a year simply trooping through division lobbies to record votes, when in fact through the deployment of technology we could vote on this miscellany of matters in minutes rather than in dozens and dozens and dozens of hours. I hope that that whole question of electronic voting, not to say online voting as an option, subject of course to the protection of the integrity of the ballot, in general elections will feature as items on the political agenda going forward. I don't think that we can hibernate from or consider ourselves exceptions to the implications of technological change. If everybody else in society is being affected by those changes, I think that Parliament should be to boot. So the thrust of my thesis here is that, of course, the Speaker should champion Parliament, but that doesn't mean treating it as a Ming vase, to coin a phrase, to be very cautiously carried across the ballroom floor for fear of it smashing, on the principle that it must be protected exactly as it is. What, in fact, we ought to be thinking of instead is a model of a parliament that keeps all that's best about it, the venerable traditions, and the explanations of how we came to evolve to be what we are as a modern democracy, but which can be supplemented by new ideas, including, in some cases, inherited from other parliaments around the world, and, for that matter, from the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, and when it's functioning, the Northern Ireland Assembly to boot. But it's not good enough just to champion Parliament and for Parliament to be effective internally. I think it is necessary for its effectiveness, its features, its plans, and its openness to new ones to be communicated to the public. And that leads me really to my second and relatively simply stated point, that public engagement, ladies and gentlemen, matters. Now, this might seem to you cerebral and discerning lot, academics, a blindingly obvious and perhaps almost rather prosaic point. But it was not without controversy when I stood for election in 2009. I set out the intention, whilst retaining the traditional and valued impartiality of the chair, to be an ambassador for Parliament and a robust advocate of democratic politics who would get out and about. And I remember being regarded with considerable suspicion by senior and distinguished colleagues for making this suggestion. Moreover, 6 months or so after I was elected, I was in my chair, ensconced in the chair, in the middle of a debate, and a senior colleague, who shall remain nameless, came up to me, and he was a very self-confident individual, considerably senior to me in terms of length of service and of years, but on that occasion, quite strikingly hesitant. And he said to me, "Mr. Speaker, sir, I didn't vote for you. I didn't vote for you. I mean, believe me, my friends, I didn't need to be Sherlock Holmes or Hercule Poirot to work out that this chap wouldn't have voted for me for a whole variety of reasons in a million years." But he nevertheless felt it necessary to communicate this point as his preface. He said, "Mr. Speaker, I didn't vote for you. I didn't vote for you. I voted for Sir George Young because I think he's a bloody good egg. But I'm bound to say, Mr. Speaker, sir, if I may, I'm bound to say, I think you've made a jolly good start. I think you're doing frightfully well. Well done, well done. I think this business of sort of, getting through questions and dragging ministers to the box, to the dispatch box to answer urgent questions. So it's absolutely right, absolutely right. But get these bloody people here, absolutely the right thing to do. So jolly well done. But can I just make my point? He said, "Can I just make my point?" And I said, "Yes, please do make your point." And he said to me, "Well, Mr. Speaker, sir, I'm bound to say this outreach business of yours. I'm afraid I don't quite get it," he said. And I said, "What do you mean you don't get it?" "Well, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, I think it's rather below stairs, he said. I mean, below stairs is the most incredibly snobbish expression. It means where the servants live. He said, I think it's rather below stairs. I mean, sir, you occupy a very important role in this house, and very right that you do. And of course, we give you an apartment where you can relax with your wife and your children when you've finished your duties in the chair. But I speak with very considerable experience of this house. My family have got very long-established connections with this place. And I said, no, I appreciate that. I still don't quite see what your point is. He said, well, what I mean to say is, if people want to know what the Speaker does and how the House of Commons works, well, they bloody well come to the House of Commons and see it at work and see the Speaker in the chair. But the idea that you, sir, personally, your very considerable distinction and high office should go trogging around the country, visiting schools and going into some bloody drafty village hall, speaking to some group of Rotary Club members or some snotty-nosed students at some college or whatever. He said, well, I mean, quite frankly, I think it's beneath the dignity of the office, he said. I think it's beneath the dignity of the office. So I said, well, I'm afraid I don't agree with that view. I very much respect you telling me candidly, and I've remembered it to this day pretty well word for word, what you think, but I'm afraid I completely disagree with you. That is a different age. We're in an age in which people who occupy high office have got to explain themselves, to communicate, to talk to hear from, to take an interest in the opinions of other people. That's part of the relationship between the representatives and the represented. So, I respect what you've said, or at least your sincerity in saying it so candidly, but I'm afraid I don't agree with that view at all. Now, whatever happens in the future, I think I can safely predict this. A successor of mine will do things that I haven't done and not do things that I have done, and that's absolutely to be expected and, in a sense, celebrated. But I very much doubt that the focus on public engagement will wither on the vine. And I hope the Political Studies Association, which has got considerable moral suasion in this matter, will not allow that to happen, because that public engagement is very important. Let me illustrate it thus. We had last year about 1 million visitors to the parliamentary estate. Over the decade almost that I've served as Speaker, I've hosted over 1,000 events in Speaker's House, in the staterooms of Speaker's House, specifically to mark, commemorate, and laud the efforts principally of voluntary organisations, of charitable institutions, very often of educational bodies to boot, because that work deserves to be celebrated and encouraged. And I know that the combined efforts of the parliamentary education and outreach services meant that last year, those services, the professional staff of those services representing Parliament, reached 2 million people across this country. Now, the majority of those were reached directly, that is to say, the contact was actual, and there was a minority that were not met directly but encountered digitally. And I think those are experiences worth having. How do we work? In what way does Parliament operate? By what means is a bill put together? How can someone have an opportunity to give evidence in the development of the thinking behind a bill? Select committees, how do they operate? Might you be a witness? If so, when? How? What form should the representation take? Etc., etc. These are, I think, important examples of public engagement. But consistent with everything I've tried to say to you this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, I turn in a sense to the question of what now? If the thrust of what I say is valid, that you should keep the best and improve the rest, you should have a sort of restless appetite for innovation, we can't stop where we are. And I would like just to float with you as I draw to a close a series of values which should inform how Parliament operates over the next decade. The first of those values, I put it to you, should be in this modern, vast, complicated and interconnected world, internationalism. I think internationalism has to be at the core of our thinking. Internationalism has, at least in part, to be a factor that drives the energy and activity of Parliament. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, and just in case there is some malign scribe located amongst your number who is planning to write this up as a coded attack on Brexit or Brexiteers, I'm not making that point. People will have their own view about the attitude of Brexiteers on the one hand and Remainers on the other, though I think it is only fair, not least in front of an academic audience, to say that one shouldn't oversimplify such matters. There are Remainers who display and evince scarcely any interest in anything beyond the European continent. And similarly, I do know Brexiteers who have a genuine, long-standing and intense interest in global affairs. So that might not be how you normally encounter it, it might not represent what you are or how you think, but I'm not making a point about Brexit. The point that I'm really making is, I don't know whether it's a simpler point or a more sophisticated point, but it is certainly a different point, that as of 2019, the UK accounts for 0.85% of the world's population. If the projected trend is followed, my friends, in 2029, that percentage is set to fall to 0.75%, 0.75% of the total global population. What I am, I hope politely but unmistakably saying to you is, there is something much bigger out there, not better than, but different from us. And it seems to me that it is a very important function of Parliament in the modern world, and in view of the miscellany of problems with which we all have to contend, that we should start to think of that, by 2029, 99.25% of the population that does not live in the United Kingdom. But on the assumption that we care about and want good relations with and would wish to provide assistance to others, let's start thinking in terms of the allocation of parliamentary time and the development of a collaborative mindset about our approach to climate change, our approach to the fight against global poverty, our approach to the international drugs trade, our approach to the challenge of identity theft, to the scourge of human trafficking, and so many other things. Let's think about what Britain's contribution, what the contribution of UK PLC and UK intelligentsia and UK civil service and UK civil society can be. Secondly, is there not something to be said for thinking as a second value about the nature of British, of UK political dialogue? Very specifically, I am concerned, as I hope you are, about what is increasingly, not least through the emergence and the proliferation of keyboard warriors, a rank discourtesy in political debate. I think that this is a real problem. The strapline, the short slogan, the few words to reflect either agreement with or very often the most vitriolic denunciation of someone else. And this seems to be something against which academe can legitimately take up its cudgels. I think a basic decorum, a basic courtesy, a basic decency or diplomacy in political argument would not be a bad thing. If Democrats who strongly disagree with each other exuding altogether too much rage, that seems to me to encourage anti-democrats who think that the ritualistic resort to personal abuse, to ad hominem attack, and even to the deployment of threat is somehow a perfectly legitimate political weapon. It isn't. Democracy is not about decibel levels, making an argument with extraordinary anger and force, or using abuse, or maligning someone's motives does not make that argument any better. A little bit like I sometimes say to people, occasionally, the honourable gentleman has made that point 3 times, but it wasn't, I'm afraid, any better the 3rd time than it was on either of the 2 previous occasions. So I think it is a problem that there's a phenomenon of hate speech. I think there's a real problem that there isn't a safe space for people to debate ideas. And I am concerned on behalf of my colleagues in Parliament that there has been unleashed a tsunami of abuse to anyone who holds and expresses a view disapproved of by others. And I'm not talking only about parliamentary colleagues. Journalists are often on the receiving end of horrific abuse, and I hope I can be forgiven for saying, as a male ally of and subscriber to the gender equality cause going back decades, that it seems to me both toxic and particularly obnoxious that some of the worst of this tsunami of abuse is directed at female parliamentarians and indeed at female representatives of the media. They dare to disagree. They stand up on a public platform and offer a view that someone else dislikes, and they are subject to this coruscating criticism, but worse, straightforward vulgar abuse and threat. And I can think of people on both sides of the political divide and on different sides of political arguments who have been its victims. And it does seem to me that it's up to Parliament to stand up to this, which is why I said some months ago in Parliament, when I saw faces on a front page of people who dared to rebel against their party, those people are not malcontents. They are not traitors. They are not enemies of the people. They're people doing what in their disinterested judgment is the right thing for the country, and indeed perhaps for the continent, perhaps for the world. And I really feel that the PSA could legitimately and usefully, academically, empirically focus on this whole question of the modalities of debate and the courtesies of debate and what is and isn't acceptable. And the third point I want to make to you is that I think there's a huge value in intergenerational respect. It is often said, and far be it from me to contradict this, that the claims of our senior citizens deserve proper attention. And Julia, I don't disagree with that, and I'm conscious that I am now myself nearer to that age than I was when I entered Parliament, and nearer than most of you. But actually, I think there is some argument for saying that on the whole, senior citizens, and this is not a criticism or an objection, are well organised. They do have lobby groups who fight their corner on a vast range of different issues, no doubt not to their complete satisfaction, but they're not poorly represented in the political debate. I want, if I may, to make a case for the young. I think there is a compelling argument for speaking up for, but more particularly giving the opportunity to young people to speak up for and to inform the political debate themselves. When I took up post as Speaker, I discovered that the UK Youth Parliament's first session, for which I had voted on the green benches of the House of Commons, was to be chaired by the Deputy Speaker, Sir Alan Hazelhurst, because my predecessor, Michael Martin, was very much Glasgow-based at the weekends, and the session was to be on a Friday, and Michael quite legitimately wanted to be in Glasgow. When I took over as Speaker, I said to Alan Hazelhurst, Alan, you take the day off, go to Saffron Walden, your constituency, or wherever. I want to chair it. Now, I absolutely admit that I wanted to chair it partly because, funny that, having just been elected speaker, I enjoyed chairing, and I thought it would be fun and rewarding. But I also chose to chair the proceedings of the UK Youth Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, because I took the rather simple view that if we in Parliament want ever again to be respected by young people, we must show respect for young people. Respect is not our automatic right, it is an earned credit. Or, to put it another way, it's a two-way street. So I made a point of chairing that session, and it has been, for me, one of the most keenly anticipated fixtures of the annual calendar. I've chaired that session every year, 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. And I made a pledge to the UK Youth Parliament that if they wanted me to do so, I would go to their conference when it took place in the summer, every year of my speakership, not as a picket, not as an unwelcome attendee, but on the assumption that they wanted me to join them, to talk to and hear from them. And I've done that every year for precisely the same reason. Yes, fun for me, but because I wanted to offer encouragement to and show respect for them. And I would love to think that maybe in the future there can be more work done between the Political Studies Association and schools, sure, but between the PSA perhaps and the UK Youth Parliament. Secondly, I value the fact that in our education centre, which I was very committed to have established, we will over a decade be able to welcome approximately another 1 million young people to come to the House of Commons and to learn through this digital, high-tech, interactive, cutting-edge, state-of-the-art facility about the journey from the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215 to the rights and representation which people in Britain enjoy today. I was astonished the other day when Jackie pointed out to me, Jackie Storer, who works as my communications advisor, that in 2018 I'd in fact engaged with students from no fewer than 21 different universities, some more than once. I remember, believe me, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know if you do from when you were undergraduates, I remember when I was trying to get visiting speakers to my university, Essex, that very often people wouldn't come, too busy, would only go to their old university, and it wasn't Essex. And I remember when I was trying to interview members of Parliament for my undergraduate thesis that people were too busy. So I've always resolved, if people have research requests, I hope I'm not going to unleash a tsunami here, if people have research requests with which I can legitimately and competently help, I would rather say yes than no. It's much better to try to be helpful than not. And in terms of meeting students, well, apart from anything else, it makes me feel younger. An optical illusion, of course, but nevertheless, it's worth a go. And it is fun to engage with students. And I take great pride in the fact that the House of Commons has forged a relationship with universities in the form of the Parliamentary Studies module. Much tribute here to Liam Lawrence-Smith, my senior clerk in the House, Clerk of Legislation, and other clerks, who put together the only approved such module for the study of Parliament between the House of Commons and initially 13 universities, then 20, and now 24. At one point, I was horrified to hear that in the name of paying attention to footfall, in other words, the numbers of people benefiting, consideration was being given to either reducing the PSM or getting rid of it on the grounds that it wasn't thought to be maximum value for money. Well, I am in favour of getting to hard-to-reach groups. I am in favour of getting good value for money, but I don't think you should look at these things in an entirely mechanistic way. The value of the relationship between Parliament and institutions of higher education can scarcely be overstated. And even if it is only about 500 people a year around the country who undertake the Parliamentary Studies module, insofar as it brokers a better understanding of what we do and how we think and the way in which we work, that seems to me to be a gain worth maintaining and cherishing. Ladies and gentlemen, I think the mission of all who care about Parliament is to preserve, protect, and promote the principle of parliamentary democracy. A very simple point, but a very valid one. I've lost count of the number of people around the world, parliamentary colleagues, speakers, members of civil society, who have said how much they take an interest in and feel a value about the British parliamentary system. You know what it is. You cannot be a prophet in your own land. We are widely excoriated in Britain, and there's no point in complaining about that. That's just the way it is. But I just want to invite you to consider the proposition that just as our universities are greatly admired in other parts of the world, even if they're often subject to attack and criticism here, so too our parliamentary system is. So what we need is people of commitment, intelligence, and passion who are determined to underscore the value of the British parliamentary system and to fight for it against all comers, against those who decry it, against those who rubbish the practice of democratic politics, against those, frankly, who subscribe instead to a preference for vulgar populism. I think of that wonderful, great, illustrious academic, Bernard Crick, Professor Bernard Crick, and I think of the Bernard Crick Central. I think of how David Blunkett so admires Bernard Crick. We have politics, and democratic politics at that, and it is flawed, and it is imperfect, and it can easily be picked apart and criticized. But just as Churchill said about democracy, it may be a lousy form of government, except for all the others. So please, in the course of your work today, at this conference, and in the weeks, months, and years ahead, let us trumpet the cause of parliamentarism, because it's the best thing we've got. It matters a lot, and it is worth celebrating. And if we don't sing the praises of our Parliament, no one else is going to do it for us. Thank you very much.